All right, my name is Nolan Kavan, and today I'll be talking about the Normanist Controversy. So first, to get an understanding of this topic, we first have to know what is the controversy about. So this controversy first originated in the 18th century, where German historians on Russia started looking into who were the people that first originated in the Kievan Rus, which would later become the both Ukraine and Russia. And so there was two sides to this, and they had differing opinions on how much influence did Scandinavian settlers have on the Kievan Rus, because the different sources said they had different amounts of influence on politics, on law, on culture, religion, and language, and this was it has been and continues to be very contested. So, why Normanism? Normans specifically were the people of Normandy. Normanism simply refers to the settling of Scandinavian peoples in the Kievan Rus. These settlers were more likely Swedish and not from Normandy. So here is the Kievan Rus. As you can see, down more towards the north section under the name, you can see Kiev, which is still there today. So the general consensus on this issue is that the Rus came from Scandinavian origin, and this is the perspective that is shown in most history textbooks, excluding some Russian textbooks, but that's a whole different story. So here we have a Scandinavian artifact that was actually found in the Rus. This kind of proves that the Viking Scandinavian settlers were there at one point, for sure. They had to be, because otherwise there was very little chance that this and many other artifacts would have been found there. But really the controversy stems around how much influence did they have? Were they just settlers that stayed there for a bit, or were they controlling the government, setting up? Were they ruling? So, as any controversy goes, there's going to be sides to different arguments of this. So first, starting off, we have the Normanists. So the Normanists believes that the Slavs invited the Viking migrants to their land, and then the Vikings, the Varangians, then became their rulers and became the people of the Rus and kind of intermingled and had a lot of influence. Then the modern Russian and Ukrainian people and the governments that followed were descendants of those people and their structures of government that they made. So the reasoning for this argument of the Normanists is they have many different reasons, but one of them is there were medieval Russian sources that said that the Rus was named after Roslagen, a place in Sweden, or named after the Finnish word for Swede, which is Ruotsi, which both sound very, very close to what was then called the Rus. Another big piece of evidence for the Normanist perspective was that there's many Norse names in the Byzantine records. They're in dealing with the Byzantine people, they often kept records, and this showed that in like treaties and other documents of the sort, there would be many Norse names, which hints at these Nordic people, or people with the Nordic name, were in control, because if they weren't, you would have seen more Slavic names. But there was many of these Norse names that hints that they were more in power. And then the final argument is that without the Western influence of these Nordic people, there would be no Russian, like state of Russia or state of Ukraine that there is today. Okay, moving on to the anti-Normanists. These anti-Normanists this kind of idea was pioneered by M. Lomonosov, who was a Russian historian who kind of every anti-Normanist had very strong nationalistic beliefs at the time, or Russian anti-Normanists. So according to these anti-Normanists, the Rus came from the Slavs, and it was purely the Slavs. They were there first, and they were the ones that ran everything. They continued on, and the people of Ukraine and Russia are direct descendants of the Slavs because they were the ones in power. They do believe that the Scandinavians were there and did impact the creation of the Kievan Rus, but not quite at the level of the Normanist belief. They weren't the ones in power. They weren't pushing language, cultural. They were just there or invaded. So some of the reasoning for the anti-Normanist beliefs are that, again, with the naming and places, stuff like the Rus was named after the Ros or the Rusna River, both places that would have been more Slavic. Another argument is that the Slavs were more advanced than the Vikings, so why would they invite them in to lead? Which is a contested point, because who is to know? And then another talking point is that many of the Slavic words contain Rus, like the word for bear. I'll butcher it if I try, but there was many of these Slavic words that contained roots like the Ros or the Rusna River that could have led to that. And then another interesting point to look at is that it was said that there was a large portion of the Slavic language was of Nordic descent, or just taken straight from the Nordic peoples. But when you look at the actual, there was a study done by the Russian anti-Normanists. They looked into the Russian language and history of it. There's only about 16 Norse words in Russian, which is not enough to say that it was founded and took many of the Norse words, or enough to be such heavily influenced by it. Okay, so moving on to some modern controversies. World War II. So this controversy only kind of emerged in the 18th century when people started to do look into the histories of these places and who had rightful claims over this and so on. So a lot of these studies and these research was done in the name of nationalism, as people were they were proud in their nation and they wanted to see where they came from and who they had claims over. So when it came to World War II and the Nazi invasion of Russia, there was lots of Nazi propaganda put out about this was pro-Normanist propaganda saying, oh yeah, we are the people came from Germanic and other Nordic places, so we have a claim to Russia because without us, the Russians would not exist. So Russia then responds with more anti-Normanism, which is saying we created this. This is our nation. The Vikings, the other Scandinavian peoples, just came in and were just a byproduct of and just lived in with us. They weren't they weren't the founders. So in conclusion, the Normanist controversy is arguably the biggest problem in Russian history, because if there was a definite conclusion to who it's a problem of who are the people, where did they come from, and who has claim to the land. This debate continues even today, and it may never be solved because a problem such as this will be so corrupted by nationalism, personal agendas, that there will always be bias, that if there is a piece of like damning like evidence that comes out saying like, oh yeah, the Scandinavian people were the leaders of the Kievan Rus and helped create it, if that's discovered by someone such as like that holds anti-Normanist beliefs, that may never come out because they don't want to share that as much. So thank you. Here are my sources.